On the evening of Sunday, March 12, 2006, 23-year-old Rost Khan bounded up the steps of Northwick Park Hospital in London, England. He was running late for the start of a clinical trial that promised to pay him £2,000 in exchange for just 3 days of work as basically a human guinea pig. But to a recent university graduate like Rost, this was incredible money. £2,000 would be more than enough for him to catch up on his many unpaid bills and put some away as savings. But if he missed the start of the trial, he was worried they wouldn't even let him in. So even though Rost hated running, he pushed himself to sprint the rest of the way up the stairs to the second floor, and then he jogged down the dingy beige hallway to the waiting room. Once inside, he found a group of men already seated around a conference table, each with a little packet of papers in front of him. A doctor in a white lab coat walked over to him, saying he must be Rost Khan, their very last volunteer. Rost nodded, his hands on his hips, trying to stop panting. He was just grateful he'd made it. Once Rost caught his breath, he sat down at the conference table and looked around and nodded a quick hello to the other men, and then he looked down at the packet of papers as the doctor in the lab coat explained that for this trial, they'd be testing an experimental drug called TGN 1412. It was designed to strengthen the body's immune system so that it could fight off cancers like leukemia. If the drug worked, it might allow cancer patients to avoid the agony of long and painful chemotherapy treatments. And so far, TGN 1412 had been tested successfully in animals, and so now it was cleared for a human trial. The doctor proudly announced that this group of men would be the first to be given the drug to see how the human body responded to the medicine. When Rost heard this, he sat up a little bit straighter. He'd done a few clinical trials before, and none of them had felt very important. But a drug that might cure leukemia could save countless lives, and so he thought it was really cool that he got to be a part of something that could potentially make medical history. The doctor told the men that tonight, the medical staff would take their vitals and give them all the same late-night snack. Then they would spend the night at the hospital. In the morning, they'd receive the drug, and for 3 days after that, they would be carefully monitored to see if they experienced any side effects from taking this drug. And that was it. Then they'd go home and would just need to come back for a few follow-up tests. The doctor beamed as he explained that once they knew how healthy people reacted to this drug, they could then test it on volunteers who actually had leukemia. Next, the doctor started reviewing a list of bullet points about how the drug was supposed to work, and as he did this, Ross sort of tuned it out and just began looking around the table at the 7 other men sitting there, and most of them were in their 20s and 30s. But as he looked around, Rost noticed that all the eyes at the table were actually turning to him now. It took a moment for him to realize that the doctor had actually asked Rost a question and was waiting for the answer. Sheepishly, he apologized and then asked the doctor to please repeat himself. The doctor cleared his voice, and then he said again what Rost had not heard. He said there were risks involved in this trial, real risks. Test subjects could possibly break out in hives, or even go into a life-threatening anaphylactic shock. The doctor then turned to Rost and asked if those risks gave him any second thoughts about joining this experiment. But Rost just kind of shrugged like it was no big deal, because for him, at all the trials he had been at, doctors always sounded this way, talking about the risks as being so bad. Are you sure you want to proceed? But honestly, Rost had already made up his mind. Besides, the trial had already been approved by the government, and all the participants were already in a hospital, so if something went wrong, they were in the right place. So Rost said, yep, no second thoughts. After Rost gave his approval along with the other men at the table, the doctor began splitting the men into 2 groups of 4. Rost was sent with 3 other men to a place the doctor called Trial Bay 1, while the other 4 participants headed to Trial Bay 2. Rost followed his group into a big white-walled room with 4 hospital beds. A desk and some cabinets had been shoved into the corner of the room, suggesting the room was normally used as an office. But tonight, it would be Trial Bay 1, complete with patient privacy curtains hanging from the ceiling. Rost and the other patients settled into their hospital bed inside of their curtained cubicles and waited for their snacks. And then after that, around 10 p.m., the lights went out, and Rost tried to get some sleep. The next morning, Rost woke up when a nurse called out good morning to the whole group and then flicked on the overhead lights. It was 7:30 a.m., which meant they had half an hour before the trial officially started. Rost stumbled out of bed and made his way to the bathroom down the hall. He wanted to change out of his pajamas and into some sweatpants before the trial actually got started. And after changing, when he got back to the trial bay, all of the curtains were now pushed back so that the room was now one big open space again. The nurse then asked Rost to please climb back into his bed, and then she explained that she was about to hook him up to a heart rate monitor. That way, nurses and trial leaders could monitor any cardiac symptoms while he was on this medication. While the nurse taped wires to Rost's chest, a man entered the room and introduced himself as Dr. Daniel Bradford. He explained that he was the lead doctor on the trial and that the dose of TGN 1412 they'd be receiving was scaled back dramatically from the highest dose they tried during animal testing. This way, the men would only get a tiny fraction of the animal dose. Dr. Bradford said that each of them would get an injection in their arms. One volunteer would be injected every 10 minutes until they had all been infused. However, only 6 of the 8 volunteers would actually receive the experimental drug. The other 2 volunteers would just be receiving a placebo, like sugar water, just for comparison purposes. Nobody, not even Dr. Bradford himself, would know who received the drug and who didn't. Ross knew this was completely normal in medical research, and it reminded him that these researchers were very serious. When the clock finally struck 8 a.m. and it was time to start, Rost watched as a nurse gave the first infusion to the patient in the bed that was next to Rost, a man whose name was David. David had told Rost the night before that he was getting married in a few months, and like everyone else in the trial, he'd signed up to make some quick cash. He wanted to pay off his credit card debt before starting this brand new life with his fiancée. The nurse slid an IV needle into David's arm and then hooked the IV tube up to a small machine. She turned it on, and then a clear liquid began flowing out of the machine and down the tube into David's arm. She told David to relax until the bag of fluid was empty, and then she looked across the bed to Rost and told him that she'd start his infusion in precisely 10 minutes at 8:10 a.m. As Rost waited for his turn, he grabbed a book off the bedside table and flipped through the pages, but he couldn't concentrate enough to actually read. He kept stealing glances at David to see if, maybe David was negatively reacting, but Rost was pleased to see David looked perfectly calm. At 8:10 a.m., the nurse came to Rost's bedside, and for some reason, Rost's stomach began fluttering with nerves. He told himself everything was fine and tried to look nonchalant as the nurse wiped the inside of his elbow with antiseptic and then stuck him with the IV needle. Rost began looking around the room to distract himself. The liquid drug felt cool as it flowed into his forearm and up into his shoulder. He actually shivered a bit, trying his best not to move. And then finally, he leaned back against the pillows on his hospital bed. The injection was over. At 8:20 a.m., so right after Rost's injection ended, the nurse began administering the drug to the volunteer on Rost's other side. Rost couldn't remember this man's name. All he knew is that he was an actor who had recently come back from Los Angeles, California on a vacation. And the nurse had just finished hooking up the IV when David, the first patient to receive the infusion, called out to her. David draped one arm across his eyes and told the nurse he had a migraine. The nurse told David she'd be right back, and then she walked out of the trial bay, and then a minute later, she came back with just a cold towel and laid it across David's forehead, and then apologized to him. She told him that they couldn't give him any kind of pain reliever since it might affect the drug trial. Rost felt terrible for David, who just groaned and pressed the towel against his eyelids. And as Rost stared at David, Rost just hoped he wouldn't develop a migraine too. And so far, he felt fine. But the more he began to think about it, the more convinced he became that a migraine was actually forming. Rost began to feel panic rise in his chest, but a few minutes went by and his head actually felt basically fine. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. 25 more minutes ticked by, and at that point, all 4 of the volunteers in Rost's trial bay were hooked up to their IVs. Rost still felt fine, but David's migraine seemed to be getting much, much worse. Rost could see that David was sweating now. His skin had turned reddish, and David said he felt like he was burning up. Suddenly, David sat up just long enough to rip his shirt off, and then he collapsed back onto his bed, complaining about stabbing pain in his head. At this point, Rost was finding it impossible to distract himself. Around the room, everyone except for David seemed to be doing fine, but in his gut, Rost felt like something was wrong here. At 8:50 a.m., Dr. Bradford sat inside of Trial Bay 2, so not the trial bay that Rost was a part of, and the doctor sat next to volunteer number 6. And as he inserted an IV into the volunteer's arm, the nurse from Trial Bay 1 strode into the room and asked to speak with Dr. Bradford in private. The doctor stepped into the hallway with her and was surprised to hear that 3 of the volunteers in Bay 1 were experiencing migraines and pain in their lower backs. 2 of them were also running high temperatures and had begun vomiting. The 3rd volunteer was racked with chills and was shaking so badly it almost looked like he had hypothermia. Dr. Bradford immediately rushed past the nurse and hurried down the hallway to see what was going on in Trial Bay 1. The drug, TGN 1412, had tested so well in animals that he had complete confidence that today's trial would go smoothly. But when Dr. Bradford burst into Bay 1, he found a truly chaotic scene. David was writhing around in his bed, his body drenched in sweat. Meanwhile, 2 other volunteers were slumped over, vomiting into yellow biohazard bags. Like David, they were red and flushed and dripping with sweat. Then the smell of urine hit Dr. Bradford, and he realized the bed sheets around the room were wet with more than just sweat. Suddenly, the volunteer in bed number 3 sprang up and screamed that he wanted to go home. Before Dr. Bradford realized what was happening, the man tore the IV from his arm and made a dash for the door. Horrified, Dr. Bradford went running after him. The doctor finally caught up with the patient halfway down the hall. Dr. Bradford coaxed the man back into his bed, explaining that at this point, they couldn't let him leave for safety reasons. The patient would be putting his own health at risk, and besides, he seemed too weak to even make it out the front door of the building. Dr. Bradford looked around, totally stunned at Trial Bay 1. Vomit and urine were everywhere, and he could barely hear himself think over all the shouting. He'd been involved in over 300 clinical trials over the years, and he'd even volunteered himself in several clinical trials back when he was in med school. And in all that time, he had never seen this level of chaos and misery. But Dr. Bradford could not dwell on that now. 2 of the patients in the ward had bright red faces, and he could hear their monitor alarms chirping. The 2 volunteers were going into shock, which meant their organs weren't getting enough blood. If Dr. Bradford didn't act fast, they could have permanent organ damage, or they could even die. The nurses started pulling the curtain dividers around the beds to give the men and the medical team some privacy. Dr. Bradford immediately began ordering drugs that would help stabilize the patients. As he worked, he glanced up, and his eyes settled on volunteer number 2. His name was Rost Khan, one of their youngest volunteers. And unlike just about all the other volunteers, Rost seemed totally fine, although he had a terrified look on his face. 3 hours later, Rost still sat on his hospital bed, feeling absolutely horrified. The last thing he'd seen as the curtains were drawn around David was the stricken look on his face. Then, Rost had been forced to just listen for 3 hours as David and the other volunteers cried and screamed and vomited, filling the air with this awful smell. It sounded like they were fighting for their lives. Rost felt invisible as he heard nurses racing around the room, tending to the other 3 volunteers. He could hear similar screams coming from Trial Bay 2 next door as well. And all this time, Rost was thinking any second he was going to get sick like everybody else. Then, Rost heard footsteps approaching his bed. A nurse pulled back the curtains, and for the first time since that morning, he was able to see beyond his tiny cubicle. The other patients were still hidden behind their own privacy curtains, but he could see bodily fluids on the floor and walls, which explained the smell that would not go away. Across the room, somebody in a lab coat was tying up a yellow biohazard bag and rushing it out of the room. The nurse took the IV out of Rost's arm and removed the wires from his chest and told him he was safe. She said he should go grab some food in a neighboring conference room, and someone would be in shortly to explain what was happening. Rost was very shaken, but hearing the nurse tell him that everything was okay made relief flood over him so quickly that he almost felt lightheaded. But mostly what Rost felt is he was just so eager to get out of this foul-smelling room. Slowly, Rost got out of the bed and moved out the door and down the hallway to the conference room next door. There were some nice sandwiches on the table, which seemed to indicate that there had been a really nice catering order that had been arranged right before all this mayhem broke out in the trial base, because it had been totally untouched. But Rost was not hungry. He was just too rattled by what had just happened. So he just stood there, waiting for what seemed like forever. At first, he could still hear the blood-curdling wails coming from the other volunteers, but as he waited, the horrible sounds died down. Finally, around 12:30 p.m., a nurse entered the conference room and told Rost to collect his things. He was being sent home. He nodded and followed her back to the trial bay. But to his surprise, all of the patients were now gone. The bay was deathly quiet. Rost felt very uneasy as he collected his wallet and book from the nightstand. He just kept looking around the room, wondering where the volunteers had been taken, and whether they would even be okay. Around 8:30 p.m. that evening, Dr. Ganesh Sundaralingam entered the intensive care unit at Northwick Park, even though it was supposed to be his night off. In the middle of having dinner with his wife that night, he'd gotten a call from Dr. Bradford that they needed his help tonight treating some critically ill patients. And then he'd been shocked as Dr. Bradford explained that 6 volunteers from that day's clinical trial were in the intensive care unit, all in truly desperate shape. Dr. Bradford explained that they were the first people ever to receive the drug TGN 1412, so nobody knew why the patients were having such strong reactions. Dr. Bradford was basically dealing with an unknown illness, and the volunteers were falling apart quickly. He didn't have much time to put this puzzle together, so he had called Dr. Sundaralingam for help. Dr. Sundaralingam stopped at the ICU bed nearest the door. A volunteer from the drug trial, named David, so the man sitting next to Rost, was hooked up to a ventilator to help him breathe. David's body was swollen, his blood pressure was very low, and it was clear that his lungs were failing. He was one of the sickest patients that Dr. Sundaralingam had ever seen, and he knew that he would soon see 5 other men in a similar condition. Dr. Sundaralingam ordered a full battery of tests right away, and when the blood work came back, he could see that all 6 patients were going into kidney failure, which could be fatal. Now, obviously, this was a massive problem on its own, but it was a particularly big issue for this hospital, because this hospital didn't have enough dialysis machines to do the kidneys' work for all 6 of these volunteers. Dr. Sundaralingam began calling around to different hospitals asking for spare machines, and when he talked to them, he told them to please hurry. Then, Dr. Sundaralingam and his staff got to work trying to stabilize the patient's blood pressure. In all 6 cases, he could see that they were suffering from some kind of blood poisoning that was causing their blood pressures to drop. If it continued, all of them were at risk of more vital organs shutting down. For a moment, the doctor wondered if the trial drug was somehow contaminated. That was the only explanation he could think of that would cause blood poisoning in all 6 volunteers. Dr. Sundaralingam looked out the ICU window and saw blue and white ambulance lights zooming up the street. Then he heard commotion in the halls, and he knew that hospital staff were racing dialysis machines up to the ICU. Dr. Sundaralingam knew he needed to get out of the way, which gave him the perfect chance to race down to Dr. Bradford's office. He needed to see every last bit of paperwork they had on this drug, TGN 1412. 30 minutes later, Dr. Sundaralingam stood outside the ICU. He and Dr. Bradford had pored over the paperwork for TGN 1412 until they found a potential diagnosis. They saw that there was an extremely small risk that this drug could trigger an immune reaction known as a cytokine storm. Cytokine storm is extremely dangerous, leading to inflammation, high body temperature, organ failure, and rapid deterioration of healthy body tissues. It is absolutely a life-threatening condition. Now, the 2 doctors began to suspect that the volunteers were suffering cytokine storms right before their eyes. Luckily, there was a treatment for this condition, however, it was very risky. In fact, it presented the doctors with a life-or-death decision. And that's because the doctors were not 100% sure what was making these volunteers sick. It was possible they were suffering from cytokine storms, but they could also be suffering from blood poisoning due to contaminated drugs. And the treatments for those 2 conditions are almost exact opposites. If these men, these volunteers, had a cytokine storm, they would need a high dose of strong drugs to shut down their immune systems. But if this was a blood infection, well, those strong drugs, the immunosuppressant drugs, those would kill them, because their immune systems would now not be able to fight the poison. And there was no way for Dr. Sundaralingam to know for certain which condition was sickening the patients. He just had to make an educated guess and hope that he chose the right course of treatment. However, before making that guess, Dr. Sundaralingam took out his phone and began calling every colleague he trusted. And he walked them through the case, getting as many opinions as possible, because of course there was just no room for error here. If he didn't choose the correct treatment, there was a strong chance all the patients would die. He listened carefully to the advice of his colleagues, and then he knew it was time. It was now after midnight, and the nursing staff was really struggling to keep the patients stable much longer. Dr. Sundaralingam made his decision and ordered the treatment. Around 3:30 a.m. that morning, March 13th, Katrina Oakley's heart was racing as she climbed the hospital steps to the ICU. An hour earlier, her phone had woken her up. She'd purposely left the phone on loud in case her fiancé David called her from the hospital, where he was taking part in a clinical trial. He told her he would be totally safe, but she had still been worried. Except the call that had just woken her up was not a call from David. It was from a nurse asking her to come to the hospital right away. Something had gone wrong during the trial. Within minutes, Katrina had been running out the door. Just outside of the ICU, a nurse met Katrina and warned her that David might look a little different. He was being treated for something called a cytokine storm, which meant he was on a lot of drugs to suppress his immune system. and as a result, those drugs had caused some serious swelling. Katrina swallowed hard, doing her best to stay calm, but feeling very overwhelmed and confused. She had a million questions about David's condition and how any of this could have happened in the first place, but first, she just wanted to see David. She followed the nurse inside of the ICU to David's bedside. And right away, she saw her fiancé's face was so swollen, his eyes were like these little tiny slits, and his cheeks were so puffed up, his head looked like a beach ball. His stomach was also so huge and distended that at first, she thought he was resting his hands on his belly under the blankets. But he wasn't. His hands were by his side, and those too were very puffy. Plus, David's skin now had a yellow tint. Katrina took one of David's hands, and as she did, he turned to look at her, but his eyes were totally glazed over, like he couldn't really see her. Katrina had to fight the impulse to scream. She couldn't understand how something like this could happen to the perfectly healthy young man she had kissed goodbye just the day before. Just after dawn, Dr. Bradford drove into the Northwick Hospital parking lot and found news cameras waiting outside. Dr. Bradford hustled past them into the hospital and flipped on the television he kept in his office. Every channel was now talking about the catastrophic medical trial, calling these sick volunteers the Elephant Men because of how they had all swollen up like balloons. Dr. Bradford ran up the stairs to the ICU, where a nurse told him that 5 of the 6 patients were still in bad shape, but they were stable. However, the 6th patient was continuing to get worse, and in fact, he could die. And later that morning, Dr. Bradford learned that Scotland Yard was now investigating for any signs of foul play in this trial. But no matter how bad Dr. Bradford felt about this, and no matter what actually made these men sick, there really actually was not much Dr. Bradford could do for the patients now. Dr. Sunthuralingam was the intensive care specialist, not Dr. Bradford. So Dr. Bradford just went home, and for the next 2 days, he was glued to the news, checking repeatedly on the condition of the men. And finally, on the 3rd morning, Dr. Bradford learned that all 6 patients almost miraculously had improved overnight. And for the time being, it seemed like they could recover. And so that morning, Dr. Bradford decided to go into the hospital, but when he arrived at his office, he found that the office itself had been sealed off by police. An officer with Scotland Yard explained that the trial bays and his office were now part of a crime scene and off limits until the investigation was over. All Dr. Bradford could do was yet again go back home and wait, as Scotland Yard and British health inspectors conducted their investigation into the trial. But Dr. Bradford didn't really care about the implications of this investigation. All he was focused on was that the patients would pull through. That's all he wanted. And not even for his own sake, but just because he couldn't bear the thought of these volunteers dying because of his clinical trial. It was horrible. Thankfully, Dr. Sunthuralingam had made the right call. The TGN 1412 clinical trial volunteers had all developed cytokine storms, and the immunosuppressive drugs had saved their lives. But while Dr. Bradford was obviously thrilled to learn that all 6 patients would likely pull through, he still had no idea what could have triggered such a rare response to this drug. It would take them months, but the health inspectors would eventually discover why this had happened. It would turn out Dr. Bradford and his team were missing some crucial information, because even though this drug had been successfully tested on animals, those animals weren't capable of experiencing cytokine storms. So even though there was some preliminary clinical research showing that TGN 1412 might trigger cytokine storms in humans, it just had not been on Dr. Bradford's radar. And in the end, it actually was not really the drug that triggered this response. It was just how quickly the drug had been administered. The volunteers had received their entire dose of the drug in just 6 minutes, which actually was 10 times faster than it should have been given. And because Dr. Bradford and his team scheduled each patient's infusion just 10 minutes apart, the staff didn't have enough time to check each patient for immediate side effects before infusing the next patient. Had the drug been administered more slowly, it almost certainly would have been less of a shock to the system, and the cytokine storm likely would not have been triggered. On the morning of Tuesday, March 20th, about 9 days after the start of this trial, 4 of the 6 trial patients had improved enough to be transferred out of the ICU. But their immune systems were so depleted that they had to stay in the hospital for another 2 weeks. David Oakley made a full recovery in time for his wedding to Katrina. However, one volunteer named Ryan developed pneumonia, septicemia, and dry gangrene. As a result of the gangrene, his fingertips fell off and part of his foot had to be amputated. As for Rost, he never got sick for one reason. He was the only person in his group to receive the placebo dose rather than the actual drug. As he watched the story of the Elephant Men unfold on national news, he knew he'd truly dodged a bullet. Eventually, David and some of the other trial volunteers who had gotten sick decided to file a lawsuit against Parexel, the company running the trial, and in 2009, they received an out-of-court settlement. In the wake of this failed medical trial, medical regulators made 22 recommendations to improve the safety of clinical trials, and these standards now apply throughout Europe. In 1974, Jean-Claude Romand enrolled in medical school in Lyon, France. He was a model student who excelled despite the notoriously brutal course load. In 1980, he married his girlfriend, and shortly after that, they had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. In 1983, he officially became a doctor and landed a great job as a researcher at the World Health Organization in Geneva. His focus was on finding new medicines to treat arteriosclerosis, also known as heart disease. His wife would proudly tell her friends that her husband was a super doctor who worked quietly in a neon-lit lab in Geneva to develop all these incredible treatments. From the outside looking in, Jean-Claude's life looked perfect, but looks can be deceiving. In the early morning hours of Monday, January 11th, 1993, Jean-Claude's best friend, Luc, received a call informing him there had been a terrible accident. In the night, a boiler had caught fire inside of Jean-Claude's house, killing his wife and his children. Jean-Claude had barely escaped alive, but when he got to the hospital, he had slipped into a coma. The 2 men had been friends for nearly 20 years. They were both doctors, they both got married at almost the exact same time, their kids had grown up together, and now Jean-Claude's family had been completely destroyed. Later that day, when Luc arrived at the hospital to see his friend, he was met with 2 policemen standing outside of his room, barring anyone from going inside. And when they realized Luc was his best friend, the policeman said, "Hey, can we actually pull you aside and talk to you about Jean-Claude?" And so Luc was confused, but he walked over and sat at a table with the 2 officers, and they proceeded to tell him that the fire that had killed Jean-Claude's family had not been an accident, and Jean-Claude was not a doctor. Jean-Claude had enrolled in medical school in Lyon back in the 1970s, but he failed to show up for his first-year exam. And without passing that exam, you can't advance in medical school, and so the school allowed him to retake the year. And so Jean-Claude did that for 12 consecutive years. All the while, he told his friends and family that he was following normal medical studies. And eventually he told them he had become a doctor. Instead of going to Geneva to discover new medicines for heart disease, Jean-Claude would drive around the border area between France and Switzerland and periodically go to the World Health Organization's Public Information Center and would just walk around the lobby and read pamphlets before going home again. When Jean-Claude went on overseas business trips, he would actually just leave his house, hop on the highway, and stop at a motel, stay there for a couple of days, and then return with gifts. He lived off money from the sale of his student apartment in Lyon that his parents had bought for him. When the money ran out, he asked his friends and family to give him their life savings so he could invest them into these schemes that he knew about because he was a UN employee. And because he's this very successful, reputable doctor, people agreed and gave him their money. But by late 1992, some of his victims were asking for their money, and he didn't have it. And so some of these people began doing some research on Jean-Claude, and they found his name was not listed on the World Health Organization's staff list. By January of 1993, Jean-Claude knew it was only a matter of time before he was exposed. And to this point, he has been living this lie for almost 20 years. His wife, his kids, his friends, his parents, everybody, he has told that he's the successful doctor, and that's all about to come crashing down. And the way he handles it is he drives to his parents' house and he kills his parents and their dog, and then drives back to his house and kills his family, takes sleeping pills, and then lights the house on fire. But firefighters were able to get to him and pull him out before he could take his own life, and so after he regained his strength, he was taken into custody and he made a confession. He was convicted of murder in 1996 and given a life sentence, but in 2015 he became eligible for parole, and in 2019 he was released. Our next story is called Drunk. In October of 2014, a 35-year-old woman who we'll call Olivia met her husband for lunch at a restaurant in western New York. The couple had not originally planned to stay at this restaurant for very long, but one thing led to another. They were having a nice time, and before long, it was 6 p.m., and they had been there for 6 hours. And over those 6 hours, both of them had had a lot to eat, lots of bread and pasta and cakes and all sorts of stuff, and they had had some alcohol. But not very much. Olivia had been careful to only have 4 drinks over those 6 hours because she wanted to be able to drive. And her husband similarly limited his drinking so he'd be safe to drive. And so after they got the check and they paid for their meal, they both hopped in their respective cars and they began driving home. As Olivia was making her way home, she unfortunately got a flat tire, and so she pulled off to the side of the road and she called roadside assistance. As she was waiting for help to show up, another motorist happened to drive by, and they misunderstood what was happening. They saw Olivia standing outside of her car with the tire popped off, and they thought she'd been in an accident. And so they called the police and reported it. And so the police show up a few minutes later, they pull up right behind Olivia, and when they get out, they ask her, are you okay? Do you need any help? And she would say, oh no, I just had a flat tire. I'm totally fine. Thank you for stopping though. But the police, as they're listening to her speak, they see her eyes look kind of glassy and glazed over like she's drunk. And as she was speaking, they could have sworn she was slurring her words. And so they said, hey ma'am, have you been drinking tonight? And she would tell them that, well, yeah, I have had a few drinks, but only 4 over the last 6 hours. And I don't feel drunk at all. That has nothing to do with the situation I'm in now. I'm not drunk. But the police were not buying it, and so they put her through a series of field sobriety tests that she managed to get through, but she struggled with enough that it sent up some red flags. And so they made her blow into a breathalyzer. A breathalyzer is a device that uses your breath to register how much alcohol is in your system, also known as your blood alcohol content, or BAC for short. BAC is scored as a percentage out of 100. And while no one should ever get behind the wheel of a vehicle if they are impaired, it is the case that in America, you are allowed legally to operate a vehicle if your BAC is 0.08% or lower. For reference, if a 160-pound female consumed about 3 alcoholic drinks, maybe a little bit more, in the course of an hour, she would most likely have a 0.08% BAC. If that same 160-pound female were to consume, let's say, 8 alcoholic drinks over the course of an hour, she would definitely not be allowed to legally operate a vehicle because she would be very, very drunk. Her BAC would have spiked to 0.2%, which would put her in the range where she would most likely have alcohol poisoning and eventually she would most likely lose consciousness. If this same 160-pound female were to consume 13 alcoholic drinks over the course of an hour, her BAC would jump all the way up to 0.4%, where she's not just drunk and unable to operate a vehicle. At that level, you're talking about potentially dying from consuming that much alcohol. When Olivia blew into this breathalyzer, she fully expected that she would be below the 0.08% legal limit, because after all, she'd only had 4 alcoholic drinks over a 6-hour period, and so that would put her well below that legal limit. But that was not the case. She blew a staggering 0.33%. The cops couldn't believe what they were looking at because they're looking at Olivia and they're thinking at that level, she should be somewhere between losing consciousness and dying. But here she is just standing there talking to us, acting a little bit buzzed. And so they assumed their breathalyzer must have made a mistake. So they went back into their car, got another breathalyzer, did it again. And again, Olivia blew a 0.33% BAC. The officers couldn't understand how this woman had such an extreme alcohol tolerance, but regardless, they charged her with driving while intoxicated and then brought her to the hospital for medical intervention. There, her BAC remained high even after a full day had passed without her consuming any more alcohol. This is around the time that it was discovered that Olivia had a very, very rare medical condition called auto-brewery syndrome, which in a nutshell meant her body transformed glucose from foods, specifically carbs like bread, pasta, that kind of thing, into alcohol. Olivia, who was totally unaware of this condition, had developed this wicked alcohol tolerance because she was basically drunk all the time. Not because she was a heavy drinker, but because she ate carbs. This condition, if left untreated, can do the same damage alcoholism and binge drinking can do to the body. The only way you can treat it is by drastically changing your diet. When Olivia's condition was discovered and made public, the charges against her were dropped, and she would go on to just stop eating carbs altogether. The next and final story of today's episode is called Identical Strangers. In 1980, Bobby Shafran was on his way up to Sullivan County Community College, which is 2 hours outside of New York City, to begin his freshman year. Even though he was from the area, he didn't know anybody that was going to this particular school, and so he was pretty nervous about it. Plus, he wasn't that popular in high school, and he had a hard time making friends. When he pulled into a parking spot at the school, he saw a sea of people getting out of their parents' cars and carrying boxes up to their dorm rooms. And so he took a deep breath, hopped out of his car, grabbed his backpack, and began walking across the lawn towards the dorm building. On his walk over, Bobby was surprised when he felt like all these random strangers on the lawn were looking at him like they knew him. And a couple people yelled out to him and said, "Hey, it's good to have you back here." And one girl actually ran up to him and kissed him on the cheek and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so happy you're back." And Bobby said, "I think you got the wrong person. I don't know you." And she laughed and she just ran away. And so Bobby's totally bewildered by this because he doesn't know anybody, but everybody seems to know him. And so he walks up the steps and he goes inside the dorm building. And as he's walking down the hall, people are high-fiving him and patting him on the back. And then right as he's about to turn the corner towards his actual dorm room, someone down the hall behind him yells out, "Hey, Eddie, what's going on, man?" And Bobby knew whoever it was yelling at him. Because this whole situation had been so weird, he felt like this had to be a case of mistaken identity. And so Bobby turned around and he saw at the other end of the hall another student who he didn't know, clearly waving at him and yelling out, "Hey, Eddie, come here. What's going on, man?" And so Bobby walks up to him and says, "Hey, I'm not Eddie. I don't know what's going on, but everybody thinks I'm somebody that I'm not, but I'm not Eddie. Who's Eddie?" And the guy said, "Yeah, okay, Eddie. It's good to have you back here, man." And then walked off. And so Bobby's like, "What is going on here?" And so Bobby turns and he goes back up to his dorm room and he goes inside and he just shuts the door. And he's thinking, I just want to be left alone for a second because this is not right. This is not how a freshman who doesn't know anyone gets welcomed at any school or any place in the world. This is totally unusual. And just a couple of minutes after being inside of his dorm room, he hears a knock on the door. And Bobby's like, "Oh, great. Who is it now? Who is it that thinks I'm someone I'm not?" So he opens the door and there's another student who he doesn't know who's standing there. And this guy, his face just drains of color and he starts shaking when he sees Bobby. And they're both looking at each other like, what's going on here? And the student says to Bobby, "Were you adopted?" And Bobby said, "Yeah." And then the student said, "Is your birthday July 12th? And Bobby said, "Yeah." And so the student goes, "Okay, my name is Michael, and I am best friends with a guy named Eddie Galland, and you are his clone. You have got to be his identical twin." At this point, to Bobby, this almost made sense, but it was so crazy to imagine having some identical twin he didn't know about. And so Bobby asked Michael if he could go meet Eddie because he's got to be a student here. And Michael said, "Well, actually, Eddie decided not to come back to school this year, which is probably why everyone you talked to was so excited to see you because they love Eddie and they thought you were him, and so they're psyched to have you back." After talking for a couple of minutes, Michael tells Bobby that they have to go call Eddie and they have to set up a meeting so that Bobby can meet Eddie and vice versa. And so Michael and Bobby run outside to a payphone booth. They hop inside, they're crammed in there, and they dial up Eddie.
And as soon as Eddie answers, Bobby grabs the phone and just says, "Hey Eddie, my name's Bobby and everybody thinks I'm you." And then Eddie says, "Yeah, I've been getting a lot of calls about that too." And Bobby would later say that when he first heard Eddie's voice, he said it sounded like his own voice coming through the phone. And so ultimately, Eddie invited Bobby and Michael to come to his house so that Eddie and Bobby could see if it really was true that they were twins. And so Michael and Bobby hopped in Bobby's car and they sped 2 hours to Eddie's house. And when they got there, it was the middle of the night, and Eddie's house is the only house in this quiet suburb that has all the lights on. And so Michael and Bobby walk up the path towards the front door of Eddie's house. And right as Bobby is about to knock on the door, it flies open, and standing in front of Bobby is his exact clone. It's Eddie. And Eddie's looking back at Bobby, and he can't believe what he's looking at. They are definitely identical twins, and they both immediately saw that. Michael would say after Bobby and Eddie just stared at each other for about a minute, they just started laughing. It was like they were total strangers, but at the same time, they had this connection immediately. They knew they were related, and they were laughing, and they hugged, and they just stared at each other. And Michael said anytime Bobby would tilt his head, Eddie would mimic it, and vice versa. It was like they were looking into a mirror. Shortly after, this story of these two long-lost brothers reconnecting found its way to Newsday, which was a prominent local newspaper in New York, and they decided they would look into it to see if it was really true or not. And so one of the editors had a junior reporter fly out and actually see Bobby and Eddie face to face and see if it was really true that they were in fact identical twins. And as soon as this reporter saw them, they knew immediately that, yep, they're related. And so Newsday printed this totally heartwarming fairy tale story about these two long-lost brothers reconnected after all these years just because of a chance encounter in college. And everybody loved it. But this is where the story went from amazing to truly unbelievable. Friends of another young man living in the New York area named David Kellman began telling David that he had to check out this Newsday article about these long-lost twins because these two twins look exactly like David. Specifically, they said you gotta look at these guys' hands. They are just like yours, David. David was known for having these enormous hands, and a lot of the pictures of Bobby and Eddie in the news showed their hands, and they too were enormous. And so David finally picked up a newspaper and looked at a picture of Bobby and Eddie, and sure enough, he was shocked. They looked exactly like him. And then when he read the article, it showed their birthday was July 12th, the same as his. And they were born at the same hospital he was born at. And so he's thinking, these are too many coincidences. They have to be my brothers. And so David called Eddie's home phone number, and Eddie's mother picked up and she asked who was calling. And David said, "Hi, my name is David Kellman. I was born July 12th, 1961. And I'm looking at a newspaper article of two identical twins that look just like me. And one of them is your son. I think I'm the missing third twin." After hearing this, Eddie's mom apparently dropped the phone and yelled out, "They're coming out of the woodwork." So Eddie and Bobby went to David's house, and as soon as they walked in and saw David, they knew right away he was one of them. He was the third twin. And apparently, within minutes of meeting each other, they were wrestling and laughing hysterically on the ground. It was like even though they were strangers, they somehow already knew each other and had an instant connection. David's family members that witnessed this first interaction said it was the most incredible thing they had ever seen. That it was just so wonderful to see these long-lost siblings finally reconnected after all these years. Shortly after David realized he was the third missing twin, Newsday did another story talking about how there was actually 3 missing twins that had all been reconnected, and once again, it was just this incredible Cinderella story, and now this story went all over the world. They were on the cover of every magazine, every newspaper, they were on every talk show, and everybody had the same question. What similarities did they discover? And they would say, well, we all wrestled in junior high school and high school. We all smoked the same cigarettes. We like the same food. We had the same taste in women. And on talk shows, when they would answer these questions, it was immediately clear that they all shared the same mannerisms. And on the show, they would routinely interrupt each other and finish each other's sentences. It really was like they were the exact same person, despite having been raised completely separate from one another. The boys loved the attention they were getting. They had become international rock stars overnight, and all 3 of them were immediately so close. They were best friends right away. They moved into an apartment together. They went out partying. They met Madonna. It was just this incredible time in their lives. And so they weren't asking questions about why they had been separated in the first place. But their parents were asking a lot of questions because they had not been told by the adoption agency that the boy they were adopting actually had two identical siblings. They had no idea. So the boy's adoptive parents reached out to the adoption agency, which was Louise Wise Services. It's based in New York, very prestigious. Basically, the most powerful and wealthy people in New York use this adoption agency if they're going to adopt. And so the parents reached out to them and asked for a meeting so they could get some answers as to why their kids have been separated. And so the parents go to New York, they go into this meeting room with the top brass of Louise Wise Services, and they say, did you separate our sons at birth on purpose? And one of the executives said, yes, we did, because it's really hard to place 3 children into one home. At which point, David's adoptive father lashed out and said, that's absolute BS. If you had told me he had 2 identical siblings, I would have taken all 3. But the agency stood by their decision and said that's the only reason it happened, and so sorry, that's all we can tell you. And so the parents were very frustrated and felt like there was much more to the story, and in fact, they felt like the agency was actually lying to them about why they had separated their sons in the first place. But they couldn't get any more information, so they left the agency, and right when they got outside, Bobby's father realized he had left his umbrella inside of the meeting room. And so he turned around, went back inside, walked down the hall quietly so he didn't want to disturb anyone, and he opened the door to the meeting room and he reached in to get his umbrella, and he looked inside and he saw the people he had just met with from Louise Wise Services had just opened a bottle of champagne, and they were laughing and smiling, and they were clearly toasting each other on a job well done. And even though Bobby's father did not go in there and confront them about what they were celebrating, he got the sense that they were celebrating having dodged a bullet, that they clearly had just lied to the families of these 3 triplets and they'd gotten away with it. And so between the parents' general sense that the agency was clearly hiding something, and then Bobby discovering this champagne toast as soon as they left, the parents decided they needed to get in touch with some lawyers to help them get to the bottom of why their sons had been separated. And so initially, a number of really prestigious law firms in New York were excited to take this case. But shortly after, they all contacted the families to say, well, actually, there's a conflict and we can't do it anymore. And the parents believed this was because the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and some of their more prominent and powerful clients were pressuring the lawyers not to dig into this, that clearly there was some secret that they did not want uncovered. And so unfortunately, the parents hit a dead end and didn't know where else to turn to try to get more information. And so over time, they kind of just accepted that this is just the way it is. And as for their sons, they didn't really care that much because the way they looked at it, at least they had each other now. And so over the years, the boys continued to stay really close. They started families of their own and had lots of family get-togethers. It was just a really happy time in all of their lives. And at some point, the boys actually went into business together and opened their own restaurant in New York called Triplets. And the first year, it was extremely successful, did over $1 million in revenue. But in the second year, the brothers started to fight with each other about how to run the restaurant. And in many ways, this was their first major conflict. They hadn't grown up together. They had never really fought. And so now they're fighting over money and how to run the business. And it got really bad really quick, and they just could not come to any sort of compromise. And so at some point, Bobby left the business. He said, I don't want to do this with you guys anymore. And apparently his departure just completely ruined the dynamic of the 3 brothers. Eddie was the most affected by this fracture in their relationships. All he wanted was for his brothers to be really close and for their families to spend time together, and now all of that was in jeopardy. And so Eddie started showing signs of severe depression and was ultimately hospitalized for 3 weeks, and then shortly after getting out of the hospital, he took his own life. This was beyond devastating for the 2 brothers and the rest of their family. Around this time, a journalist named Lawrence Wright, who had always had a fascination with identical twins, found an obscure scientific article called Psychoanalytic Study of the Child. It detailed a New York-based study about identical twins that were intentionally separated at birth and then given to different adoptive families to be studied, although it wasn't clear what they were actually studying or why they needed identical twins to do this research. In this article, Lawrence discovered all the babies that had been used in the study came from the same adoption agency, the same one the triplets had come from, the Louise Wise Services in New York. And so Lawrence called Bobby and told him that based on this article, it seems like he and his brothers were used in a scientific study. Bobby and David were totally furious. They felt like they'd been treated like lab rats. They also wondered if their being separated at birth had a negative impact on their mental health, and that might have contributed to Eddie's depression and untimely death. Lawrence wound up writing an article about this twin study he had discovered, and after he published it, another set of twins found out they had been a part of the study and discovered themselves. These two women were also struggling with depression, furthering the idea that the study could have led to irreparable harm to their subjects' mental well-being. At this point, David and Robbie did not expect anybody to be held accountable for this study. Instead, they just hoped to find out why it was done and what they were testing for and what the results were. And so they began working with Lawrence to try to get those answers. They contacted Louise Wise Services, who did admit that yes, actually this was part of a study, but they didn't give any information about what the results were or why they did it. And so they did some digging and they discovered the guy in charge of the actual scientific study was this doctor named Peter Neubauer, who was this very well-known psychologist in New York. And so Lawrence managed to get an interview with this doctor, but the doctor basically said, I won't answer any of your questions and I won't give you any information about this study. And he never published his findings. Right before the doctor died in 2008, he made sure the entire study was put under seal inside of the Yale University archives so no one could access it until 2066, which has led many people to believe that the reason he set it so far out was to guarantee all of these subjects in this study would have died by the time it was made publicly available, protecting his own legacy and the people that were involved in this study. In the recent documentary called Three Identical Strangers, Dr. Neubauer's personal assistant, a woman by the name of Natasha Josefowitz, she was interviewed and they asked her, can you shed any light on why this study was done, what they were testing for, and what the results were? And she would say that she was not actually part of the study. She was more on the periphery, but she was privy to what they were doing. And she said the point of the study was to finally put to bed whether it was nature or nurture that made the person who they ultimately become. Basically, are your surroundings the thing that ultimately makes you who you become? Or is it just your genetic makeup, that you're predestined to become a particular person independent of how you were raised? And she said the results were incredible, that basically it has nothing to do with nurture. It's all about your genetic makeup. That we unconsciously trend towards specific behaviors and decisions, but we believe it's free will. We believe we're choosing to do certain things, but in reality, it's basically predetermined. And specifically, in the triplets case, Bobby was intentionally placed into a more affluent household where his father was a doctor and his mother was a lawyer, and so they were very well educated, and that was his upbringing. Eddie was placed into a more middle-class family with his father being a teacher and his mom being a stay-at-home mother. And David was put into a low-income household where they were all immigrants, English was a second language, and they just had this very small shop that they owned. And Natasha said this study demonstrated that despite these boys being put into different socioeconomic levels, it had almost no impact on who they ultimately became. She said she doesn't know why the study wasn't published, but she hopes someday it will be. Also, in this documentary, a doctor named Lawrence Perlman, who was actually one of the researchers in the study that would actually make house visits to each of the boys' houses as they were growing up under the false pretext that they were there as part of routine follow-up for the adoption agency. And he went on record and said that the study was not just about the effects of socioeconomic class, it was really about the effects of different styles of parenting. He said in the triplets case, each of the boys had been placed into their respective households after that household had already adopted another child. And that first child they adopted effectively became the guinea pig for this study, where scientists would come in and they would study this child under the false pretext that they were there just following up for the adoption agency, but really they were creating a baseline of how do these parents parent. And then once that baseline was established, then the triplets were sent into their respective homes, with the researchers knowing full well how they were each going to be brought up, with the adoptive father being the X factor. Bobby's father, who was a doctor, was rarely around, but he was devoted and loving to his son. David's father, who was the shop owner, was around all the time and adored his son and loved him unconditionally. Eddie's father was a teacher who was around a fair amount, but when he was very strict and rough with Eddie and quick to discipline him and rarely showed any affection for him. And while Dr. Perlman does not come out and say that Eddie's relationship with his father probably had an effect on him becoming depressed and ultimately taking his life, there are many other people close to this case that believe that's exactly what it was. That David and Bobby had a stable, healthy upbringing and Eddie did not. And so when he was faced with the crisis of the brothers separating, Eddie couldn't handle it. These same people refute what Natasha said about the findings of the study that we're all genetically predisposed to become a particular person. They say if that was the case, then why haven't David and Bobby taken their lives? But ultimately, because the study was never published, we won't know for sure why it was done, what they studied, and what the conclusions were. All we have is speculation and second and third-hand information. But what we do know for sure is the surviving triplets and their families are furious that this study was done. They feel like it ruined their lives. Following the release of the documentary 3 Identical Strangers, Bobby and David were actually granted early access to the study that was sealed inside of Yale University. And when they looked at it, they were expecting to be blown away with the results, but it turned out it was over 10,000 pages of very technical information, and much of it was heavily redacted, so they couldn't even read most of it. They were not able to deduce what the purpose of the study was in the first place, or what it accomplished. It was just all very ambiguous. This study was ultimately shut down permanently in 1980, the same year the triplets discovered themselves. As for the adoption agency, Louise Wise Services, and all the scientists and researchers involved in the study, none of them were held accountable for their role in this totally unethical study. And so basically everything was swept under the rug. And so Bobby, David, and all of the family members of the triplets were just left with a whole bunch of questions and not a lot of answers.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows.